Buchanan, or Roy as he would later be known as, was born on September 23, 1939 in Ozark, Arkansas. Leroy's dad, Bill, had Scottish roots and was a sharecropper during the tough times of the Depression, farming along the river in Arkansas. Bill and his wife, Minnie Bell Reed, had 4 kids: JD, Betty, Leroy, and Linda Joan. When Roy was 2, the family moved to Pixley, California in the San Joaquin Valley, where Bill found work as a farmhand. Unlike in Arkansas, where sharecroppers kept most of the harvest, in California, farm laborers worked various fields that belonged to others. Roy later claimed that his dad was a preacher, a tale that stuck despite his brother JD jokingly saying their father was the last person you would ever find in a church. To give her kids better opportunities, Minnie arranged for Leroy to take music lessons. He dabbled with the guitar around age 5, picking up a few chords. At 9, Leroy received a red Rickenbacker lap steel guitar and lessons from Miss Clara Louise Prescher, a traveling music teacher from Bakersfield. Leroy learned to play by ear during his 3 years of lessons, which moved Miss Prescher to tears when she discovered he could not read music. But one key piece of advice from her stuck with him: play music with feeling, or do not play it at all. Leroy enjoyed listening to steel guitar on the radio, admiring players like Jerry Byrd, who incorporated the steel guitar into contemporary country music. The Bakersfield area, close to where he lived, was known for its unique country sound, influenced by telecaster players such as Buck Owens and Roy Nichols. Leroy soaked up these styles and wowed local school and church events with his steel guitar renditions of popular radio tunes. His friend Freddie Ramirez recalled he could play all the Hank Williams songs just as if they were on the record. Around the early 50s, when Leroy was about 12, he joined Marvin and Paul Kirkland's band, the Joaquin Valley Boys, playing lap steel and quickly becoming the highlight of the shows. By 1952, he'd started playing a standard guitar and mastered the Roy Nichols picking style. A few years later, on a trip to Stockton, California with his brother, he discovered the blues. High school, Leroy formed the Dusty Valley Boys with friends Daryl Jackson and Bobby Joe. He and Bobby later played professionally in local bars with bandleader Custer Bottoms. Leroy's passion for the guitar outgrew his interest in school, and at 16 he moved to LA to live with his siblings. He brought with him a Martin acoustic and a hollow body Gibson electric guitar. By this time, he had the skill to make his electric guitar mimic a steel guitar, bend notes, and play any tune that he heard on the radio. Music was changing with the times, as rock and roll was emerging from rhythm and blues, and Buchanan was determined to be a part of that new wave. In Hollywood, a man named Bill Orwig convinced Leroy Buchanan to join a rather kitschy rock and roll group. The band, known as the Heartbeats, included drummer Spencer Dryden, who would later join Jefferson Airplane and New Riders of the Purple Sage. The Heartbeats appeared in a movie of the time called Rock Pretty Baby. The Spencer Dryden will recall their shared passion for the rhythm and blues and early rock and roll, which quickly bonded them. The band was making money during a vibrant time. The year was 1956. Elvis was the icon of the era. James Dean was still around, and rock and roll was all the rage. Everybody was trying to find their way into the scene, even though they were mostly winging it. Orwig, however, had his own plan. And Orwig's plan was basically to swindle the Heartbeats in order to profit himself. When he left the band stranded in Oklahoma City, the members were left to fend for themselves. Roy secured a position as a staff guitar player on the Oklahoma Bandstand in Tulsa. When Dale Hawkins, known for his hit Susie Q, appeared on the show, Roy followed him to Shreveport, and that's when his true rock and roll journey actually began. In Chicago, they recorded Willie Dixon's My Babe at Chess Records, marking the first professional recording that Roy did. His sharp, distinct intro and flowing notes on that record are still admired to this day. For nearly 2 years, Hawkins and Buchanan toured the U.S., with Dale perfecting his stage presence and Roy playing incredible rock and roll riffs. Hawkins was known for choosing talented guitar players, and many greats had been in his band before and after Buchanan, including Sonny Jones, James Burton, Carl Adams, Kenny Paulson, Scotty Moore, Hank Sugarfoot Garland. On the road, they learned to cope with a rough rock and roll life, using stimulants to keep up with a demanding schedule, and they knew how to wow the crowd every single performance. Rock and roll, they knew, required real effort in order to be great. Dale Hawkins, the strict leader, would debrief after each set to address any issues and insisted on discussing them repeatedly. He was one of the few who could get Roy to play exactly what he needed, not by force, but through some kind of spiritual connection. Hawkins needed a band that could support him, but also knew when to let loose. Roy appreciated Hawkins' demanding style, acknowledging that his insistence made him a much better musician as a result. In the subsequent years, Roy and well-known studio bassist Joe Osborne joined various acts, from Jerry Hawkins to Bob Luman. Luman even took Roy to Tokyo in December of 1959. They made records and toured extensively. By 1960, Buchanan had settled in Washington, D.C. and recorded 2 versions of After Hours, a song with significant cultural importance. Roy's versions were inspired by Jimmy Nolan's 1956 version for Federal Records. He recorded one take slowly and another quickly, showcasing his exceptional skill as a blues guitar player at only 21 years old. While there are other blues players active at the time, such as Lonnie Mack, Link Wray, Travis Womack, and Steve Cropper, not to mention the earlier generation of blues artists like Hubert Sumlin, few were as accomplished as Roy, a country boy from Pixley. By then, Roy had grown a beard, let his hair grow long, and adopted this bohemian look with an intense stare. He had also switched from his Gibson hollow body to a Telecaster, marking a new phase in his music career. In Roy Buchanan's group, the Telecaster guitar was brought to life. He played the blues with such tenderness and added a steel guitar-like twang to country song. He had mastered the art of making the guitar weep by bending a pluck note and subtly adjusting the volume with his right pinky finger. His use of the pinky for volume and ring for the tone control produced a distinctive wah-wah effect. This technique was his unique creation, done the hard way without shortcuts. In October 1960, while performing at the Rocket Room in Washington, D.C. with Dale Hawkins, Roy met Judy Owens, a young admirer who complimented his guitar skill. 1 year later, they got married, which significantly influenced Roy's career path. However, before settling down, Buchanan went with Roy Hawkins to Canada in January 1961, an event that would leave its mark on rock history. In Toronto, Roy encountered Ronnie Hawkins, Dale's cousin, who dominated the local music scene. Ronnie convinced Ray to join his band, primarily to mentor his raw but talented guitarist, Robbie Robertson. Buchanan's task was to teach Robertson the finesse of playing in support of a singer, ensuring not to overshadow or underplay the lead. When Robertson inquired about Roy's techniques, Buchanan jokingly claimed he was half wolf. Robertson remembered being intimidated by Buchanan's unconventional playing style, which included bending the guitar neck and manipulating the guitar's volume. Ronnie Hawkins recognized Buchanan's superior skills, noting that while Robbie was quite talented for his age, Roy's experience made him a master. However, Ronnie needed someone who could commit to regimented practice with a focused mindset, while Roy was much more of a free spirit, ill-suited for those structured settings. Moreover, Hawkins observed that Buchanan seemed to engage in psychological complexity, leaving people to wonder whether he was really smart or just incredibly eccentric. By the summer of 1961, Buchanan had joined a group called the Bad Boys in Virginia and soon married Owens. He spent almost 2 years in the Philadelphia area with Bob Moore and the Temps, the resident band at Dick Lee's Musical Bar in Belmore, New Jersey. It was there that Seymour Duncan became acquainted with him. Even Les Paul paid a visit to see if rumors of Buchanan's extraordinary talent were true and found himself completely astonished as well. Les Paul remarked that Buchanan's playing was unlike anything he had heard before. He was fascinated by Roy's unconventional approach, noting that he did not adhere to traditional scales and arpeggios like taught in music school. Buchanan's playing was unrestrained. He followed no rules and would do whatever it took to achieve the sound that he wanted. Whether picking or plucking with his fingers, Roy was in a league all of his own, cruising along a musical path uniquely carved by himself. Roy Buchanan contributed his dynamic guitar skills to a variety of records for Dick Clark's Swan label in Philadelphia, working with the Temps and under his own name. Despite his talent, he did not get a deal for himself, although he did play on several albums. Buchanan felt betrayed by the music business when Bobby Gregg took credit for The Jam, a track featuring Roy's distinctive guitar riffs. This track, which did not include Roy's name, ended up climbing the R&B charts in 1962. Moreover, Roy's innovative use of the pinched harmonic was heard on another track, Potato Peeler. Following the birth of their first child, and with Roy's escalating pill use, the family moved into the home of his mother-in-law in Mount Rainier, Maryland. It seemed his days of traveling and rock and roll from 56 to 63 were over at this point. The arrival of the Beatles in 1964 overshadowed American players like Buchanan, who could have outplayed George Harrison in a heartbeat. But Roy settled for playing as a session musician in local clubs across D.C. and the Maryland suburbs. His reputation grew throughout the 60s as he played with acts like Danny Denver, the British Walkers, the Collin Twins, and many others. As his family expanded to more than 6 children, Roy played incessantly to support them, but often stayed out for days after gigs, which totally strained the family life. By 1967, he was playing covers in his own style of blues in various Georgetown bars, remaining relatively unnoticed, while other rock icons at the time were gaining fame. A lengthy recording of one of Buchanan's sets from this era captures him experimenting with songs by Jimi Hendrix, Jimmy Reed, and Bill Justis. In 1968, John Gossage gave Roy tickets to see Hendrix perform. Buchanan realized his manually created wah-wah sound was being replicated by Hendrix using electronic pedals. This pushed Roy to embrace his own traditional American guitar style. As a young guitarist, Danny Gatton frequently attended Buchanan shows, forming a friendship and a rivalry with him at the same time. For Roy, these were tough times. He stopped playing guitar and in January 1969 enrolled in a barber school to learn a trade in order to be able to support his family. His extraordinary talent remained unrecognized, typical of the volatile mix of opportunity and disappointment in America. At some point, Charlie Daniels signed Roy to make a studio album for Polydor Records. They recorded tracks in Nashville, but Buchanan completely scrapped the album, dissatisfied with it, thinking that it was sounding way too generic. He also turned down a job offer from the Rolling Stones after Brian Jones' death in 1969, and this was a job offer that was actually conveyed through Daniels as well. Yet according to Charlie Daniels, he never actually did set Roy up with this gig after all, and that he just chalks it up to another one of Roy's greatest hits of tall tales that he liked to tell back in the day. Buchanan had a knack for telling stories that seemed believable, yet they left people questioning their veracity. One such story, for instance, is how he came to own his iconic 1953 Telecaster. Buchanan said he spotted somebody walking by the barber shop where he worked with a worn telly. Buchanan said that he felt an immediate connection to the instrument and impulsively left a customer mid-haircut in order to approach the man. He promised to trade him for the most beautiful guitar he could find, insisting, "I really want that guitar." And Roy's story has it that, true to his word, Buchanan acquired a purple Telecaster through a well-connected friend, and by the end of the day, they had exchanged those guitars. Buchanan described the moment as if the man recognized that the guitar belonged to Roy. By 1970, Buchanan was back playing music, this time with lounge singer Danny Denver at the Crossroads bars in Bladensburg. It was here, with his 53 Telecaster, that people began to take notice of his exceptional guitar playing. While locals were already familiar with him, his reluctance to record had become stuff of legend. He formed his own band, the Snake Stretchers, and he recruited organist Dick Hines from Danny Gatton's band. Ignoring his contract with Polydor, Buchanan produced a raw album with the Snake Stretchers that was sold in burlap bags at their shows. This burlap bag album has since become a prized collector's item. The media started to pay attention. Bill Holland introduced Buchanan to local newspaper readers through an article in the Washington Star, and a subsequent feature by Tom Zito in the Washington Post piqued the interest of Rolling Stone magazine, which reprinted Zito's piece. Zito captured the essence of the Crossroads bar as a dim, damp place with attentive waitresses, and he noted Buchanan's indifferent reaction to the adulation he received. The Rolling Stone article caught the eye of WNET TV producer John Adams, who decided to produce a documentary on Buchanan. This project catapulted him to fame. Yet in the documentary, filmed by his childhood home in a cotton field near Pixley, California, Buchanan shared his personal perspective on music and success. He expressed that his lack of concern for fame might be why he never made it big. For Buchanan, success was about mastering the guitar for his own satisfaction. setting personal goals, and feeling a sense of achievement internally, regardless of fame or wealth. Things started happening quickly. A student from American University asked his music teacher, Charlie Bird, who the best rock and roll guitarist was, and Bird sent him to see Buchanan at the Crossroads. Buchanan was playing with his back to the audience to keep his guitar techniques a secret, and he had his amplifier facing backward to soften the sound in the small room. The student, J. Reich Jr., became Buchanan's manager and got him gigs all over the East Coast, leading to a sold-out show at Carnegie Hall in June 21, 1972. Buchanan was nervous but played very well. A producer from Polydor, Pete Keefe Siegel, convinced Buchanan to come back to the studio, promising him control over the music. Siegel had seen Buchanan play at the Crossroads, and they agreed that Buchanan and his band would record in New York exactly what they wanted. The partnership with Siegel led to Buchanan's self-titled debut and his second album. The first album had a mix of Buchanan's own songs, blues, and country standards. His song The Messiah became known for its powerful melody and personal lyrics. The second album had deep blues, old rock and roll, a country song, and another personal song called Thank You Lord, where Buchanan expressed his gratitude in a simple and heartfelt way. Critics loved both albums, but they didn't sell as well as Polydor hoped, and Siegel left the company. Buchanan had already left the Snake Stretchers and put together a new live band. However, the band fell apart after a trip to England in May of 1973. That fall, Buchanan recorded a third album which did not do well critically. But some tracks were strong, including a tribute to Jimi Hendrix and a song called Nepesh, which means soul in Hebrew. During the recording, Buchanan met John Lennon, who was working in the studio next door. Lennon offered to collaborate with Buchanan, but he actually declined. Even with mixed reviews, Buchanan continued to tour with what was considered his finest band lineup, which included Blue-Eyed Soul vocalist Billy Price and bassist John Harrison, both hailing from Pittsburgh, alongside drummer Bert Foster. Malcolm Lukens, a student of Buchanan's previous organist Heinz, took over the organ duties. In the summer of 1974, Buchanan went into the studio with session musicians to record In the Beginning, another album for Polydor Records. This record was more consistent than the one before it, but it did not shine as brightly. Buchanan and his manager ultimately decided that a live album would be the best way to fulfill their contract with Polydor. They recorded 2 performances at New York's Town Hall on the evening of November 27, 1974, which resulted in Livestock, an album that showcased Roy's extraordinary guitar skills and is considered one of the greatest live guitar albums. The album featured songs like Reelin' and Rockin', a true swing piece, and Price's rendition of Further Up on the Road, a rhythm and blues classic. Roy sang and played the guitar in fiery blues numbers like Roy's Blues and I'm Evil, demonstrating his ability to captivate an audience. He also performed on Hot Cha, a gentle country melody with a cha-cha rhythm, once played by Junior Walker. While recording on the album, his manager gave a tape of Livestock mixes to Eric Clapton, who he ran into at a New York hotel. Clapton later incorporated Buchanan's arrangement of Further On Up the Road into his set, leaving out the same verses as Price did on the live album, which they took as a sign that Clapton was actually influenced by Roy's version. By this time, Jeff Beck had become aware of Buchanan's talent and his Telecaster-driven American roots music. Beck recounted years later how he had been awestruck watching the WNET documentary on Buchanan in 1971 and was amazed by the playing that he heard. This actually led him to inquire about Buchanan to concert promoter Bill Graham, praising his innovative style. Despite his reputation for electrifying performances in clubs, Buchanan remained largely unknown to the broader public, often eliciting the question, "Roy who?" from those who are unfamiliar with the work. Roy eventually signed with Atlantic Records after Ahmet Ertegun saw him play at Carnegie Hall in 1972. With a big advance in hand, he went to the studio to record A Street Called Straight, an album reflecting his battle with staying clean and sober. Produced by R.F. Martin, the album had several standout tracks, including a cover of Jimi Hendrix's If 6 Was 9 and Good God Have Mercy, written by Billy Roberts, who is also the composer of Hey Joe. Buchanan paid tribute to Jeff Beck with a powerful instrumental called My Friend Jeff. That same year, Beck released his album Blow by Blow, which included 'Cause We Ended As Lovers, which was a track dedicated to Roy. For the following album, Loading Zone, Atlantic brought in an excellent fusion bass player, Stanley Clarke, as producer. Clarke reportedly told Buchanan to avoid playing upstrokes during the recording. Buchanan was initially excited about a duet with Steve Cropper on the classic Green Onions, but he was completely disappointed when Stanley Clarke sped up the recording, making the duet appear more like a competitive showdown. Buchanan released another album, You're Not Alone, which had decent sales but didn't live up to the musical standards of his earlier work, and Atlantic Records was not happy with the sales. In Roy's defense, he often arrived at recording sessions without too much planned, leaving producers to come up with a plan on the spot. This approach had worked with Pete Segal, but it led to a lot of frustration during the sessions. Roy later admitted that this was partly his fault for being way too passive in the studio. However, not everything was bleak. The recordings from a tour in Japan in June '77 led to the album Live in Japan, although it was never released here in the States. Barring 2 tracks on Polygram's Sweet Dreams, Buchanan regarded this hard-to-find album as one of his best performances. By the late 70s, several things caused Buchanan's career to decline. His preferred band disbanded after the Japan tour, and for the next several years he rarely had his own group, often playing with many pickup bands. His attempt to produce his album My Babe did not succeed. After this effort, Roy stopped recording for a while. During this time, he was hospitalized with serious injuries, which he and his wife claimed were the result of police brutality following a vague arrest. However, one person close to the family suggested that Roy did those to himself when he tried calling it quits in a jail cell by strangulation. This event occurred on New Year's Eve, 1980. In the early 1980s, Buchanan's career continued to struggle. He moved from show to show with various temporary bands, occasionally performing well with rockabilly singer Scott Anderson. The fact that his wife Judy, who had no background in music, was arranging his gigs might have made things more difficult, and his widespread use of cocaine during the time did not help matters at all. Observers noted that during this time, Roy stopped playing his beloved 53 Telecaster, and some thought this actually had some kind of deeper meaning. The guitar had nearly been stolen several times. Buchanan suggested that that was the reason why he stopped using it, but there's an unconfirmed story that he lent it for repairs and it came back with damaged pickups. He tried different guitars, including Strats, New Tellys, and Les Pauls, and shortly before his death he had a custom model made for him by the Fritz brothers. Roy's career saw a positive turn when he performed at Albert's Hall in Toronto in late '84, impressing Bruce Iglauer, founder of Alligator Records. When Bruce saw Buchanan again in Chicago, he helped Roy fix a blown fuse on the amplifier during a performance, which led to a bond of trust and a recording contract. Bruce was careful to guide Roy successfully through the recording process. Dick Sherman, a producer at Alligator, also worked on the recordings and recommended songs from older blues artists that suited Roy's style and vocal range. Sherman recalled that Roy loved to smoke cigars, and Bruce would join him. Sherman's wife disliked the cigar smoke that filled their house during the pre-production weekends. Roy also used lemon-scented Pledge on his guitar for slickness, which filled the air with its scent whenever he was working on a project. In 1985, Alligator released When a Guitar Plays the Blues, which marked a shift from Buchanan's previous raw sound. Some people who knew Roy in the 70s felt his album lost some of its raw, emotive power, while others appreciated the more polished sound. Bruce and Sherman aimed for more of a sophisticated production, bringing in singer Otis Clay and experienced Chicago musicians to back him up. Roy used a brand new Telecaster at first, and then for another Alligator album, he played a gold-top Gibson Les Paul. Roy also made another unconventional choice by using a Boss DD2 delay pedal. Now this pedal was known to enhance the sound by mimicking tape echo effects. Roy really liked to change it in his music and responded to critics by saying it was part of his desire to grow and appeal to younger audiences. And the change actually went over well, as evidenced by the album When a Guitar Plays the Blues being nominated for a Grammy for Best Blues Album. When his career revitalized, Buchanan got professional management and went on several tours. Roy and his new band, a power trio, traveled across the US and to places like Europe, Australia, and Japan. From '85 to '86, he performed with six-string bassist Jeff Gans and drummer Ray Marchica, and from '87 to '88, he often played with bassist Kerry Ziegler and drummer Vince Santoro. In 1986, Buchanan went to the studio to record Dancin' on the Edge, featuring Delbert McClinton on vocals, Donald Kinsey on guitar, and Stan Zelest on keyboards. Hot Wires, released in 1987, had many of the same musicians, with Kanika Kress taking over vocals from McClinton. The combination of Roy's instrumentals and cheerful blues covers on these records were really well liked, but they did not sell very well. Roy's comeback also seemed to stir up his past troubles as well. The late 80s saw him struggling with trying to stay sober, and there were varying opinions about how much this troubled him. In 1988, Roy opened for the band on their US tour. Robbie Robertson had left the band after The Last Waltz in 1976, and Richard Manuel had passed away in 1986. Buchanan and the remaining members of the band had memorable jam sessions, playing songs like Willie and the Hand Jive. Before heading to Australia in the spring, Roy shaved his head. Some thought this was a sign of a new commitment to sobriety, but drummer Vince Santoro remembered it as simply him trying to look a little better because he was losing his hair. Roy took a break from his summer touring schedule after an outdoor concert at Guilford Fairgrounds in Connecticut on August 7, 1988, where his final performance was a rendition of Albert King's Drownin' on Dry Land. He returned to his home in Reston, Virginia to rest. He had a show lined up with Johnny Winter at the Toronto Blues Festival and was thinking about making his next Alligator Records album entirely instrumental. He had recently received the first guitars made for him by the Fritz brothers. On the afternoon of August 14th, Roy recorded a bit of a new song that he was working on. Afterward, his wife drove him to a local shopping center to do some shopping. Roy stopped in at a tobacco shop to buy some cigars and went to Ruby Tuesdays for a few drinks afterwards. That evening, he came home drunk with a total stranger. His wife Judy was upset and she ended up calling the cops. Roy then pulled the phone out of the wall and left the house. The Fairfax police found him walking down Glade Street close to his home and took him into custody. Officers spoke with Judy at the house while others took Roy to the Fairfax County Adult Detention Center on a charge of public drunkenness. Carl Peed, the public relationships officer for the Fairfax PD at the time, who later became sheriff, stated that soon after Roy was placed in a holding cell, he was found with a severely injured throat and passed away on the way to the hospital. The sheriff's office investigation concluded that Roy, who weighed 220 pounds, had tied the shirt to a low bar on the cell door, and of course the rest of that is history. However, the circumstances of the night still remain unclear. Even years later, examining the evidence doesn't provide a clear conclusion. At Roy's funeral, a former bandmate mentioned that Judy opened the coffin for them to see. This person claimed to have seen bruises on Roy's head. However, the coroner's report did not mention any head bruises, which raised a lot of unanswered questions. Whether Roy's end was at his own volition or at the hands of another, Roy's music resonated deeply with so many. He was an amazing guitar player who always told a story in his solos. He had a really quiet vocal delivery, which brought total swagger to his live performances. His phrasing was really playful, and his tone was always to die for. Roy may have missed out on a lot of opportunities to break it big, but there is no doubt that he was so ahead of his time that he's continuing to blow minds every time somebody new gets the opportunity to discover his work. So if you like what you see here, make sure you smack that like button. And while you're at it, smack the subscribe button and join the family. And I want to thank you so much for watching.